Hi guys, my name is Christina and welcome to my channel. Welcome to another episode. Welcome to another episode of Drawing Session, podcast style of videos. So today I wanted to talk to you about why do we hate stories? Why so many people, including ourselves, rant about stories, about storytelling and feeling pissed off and done dirty by stories. So, art in general does invoke quite a lot of emotion. This is just the nature of art, that what it does, it just goes through to our hearts and makes us feel something. Sometimes these emotions are very meh, not so strong. Sometimes they're very intense. They can be good, they can be bad, they can be very complicated. And when we, see the story that invokes certain emotions from us, we sometimes go and post our opinions, we post our reviews, we post our thoughts, and every story that you can look up, like I'm talking, when I say stories, I mean both comic books, movies, TV shows, I'm talking about books, novels, anything that is a storytelling. Even like musicals, Broadway shows, doesn't matter. Whatever has the element of storytelling, you can look it up, anyone that is more or less known, and you will find good and bad reviews. You can go to the Goodreads for the novels and see all sorts of reviews. So whatever people are feeling, they're talking about it. However, sometimes, when I think it's something that we'll a lot notice, that some stories are not bad stories, but they get quite a lot of negativity, and it looks like amount of negative reviews are just unproportional for what story is. And small plot line or small story development or like small detail about the story, small choice that main character made or something like that can really upset us or upset some people, and we see very strong negative reviews about the stories that are objectively not bad stories, like at all. So even I myself just made a video when I was talking about Avatar for the second movie, The Way of Water, for more than an hour. And I was talking about things I didn't like, but I didn't hate the movie. I actually think it was fine. But the main thoughts that I expressed were, I would assume, negative. That was the main point, that I was talking about things that I didn't like. So it's not lost on me that I'm doing the same thing. That's why I'm saying we. Right now, I'm not saying like some people do that, like I do it myself. So I was actually started to think, why is that the case? Also, I just need to admit to you guys that I am a big fan of just watching ranty videos about different stories. I do prefer them. I just do like the analysis. They're typically longer. People, I just, sometimes I don't watch the actual story. I just watch the negative review video that is forever, and I understand what the story is about because people have so much to say. So I'm exposed to all of that myself. So why today I want to talk about this is that, we are both consumers of art, and we are at the same time artists who produce art. We are exposed to people's opinion about our art on its own. And also, like, I think when you're exposed to other people talking negatively about art of other people, it's easy to start thinking, oh my God, like this is a very famous artist, this is a very famous writer, this is a very famous, movie maker. And they get that they get this amount of like hate, or this amount of people like disliking what they've done, like, oh wow, they're hating about the character doing this decision, or character having this thought, or character doing this small thing, or like this small part of the plot, or they hating about what the story started from this point, not another point. Like, Jesus, if these guys getting so much flack for these small things, what do I to expect? Like, it can get a little bit overwhelming, and feeling like it's scary to put your art out there, or just to do art overall. It feels like it has to be some level of perfection just to put it out there. And that's why I wanted to discuss about this, because it's definitely a phenomenon when people get very passionately negative about art. And my personal pet peeve is that, like, especially when people start rewriting the stories. It's after, especially, I think I remember after Game of Thrones, the last season 7 aired. I remember there was so many videos that we're about like rewriting season 7 of Game of Thrones, rewriting the last episodes of Game of Thrones, rewriting or doing that. Or I think people also had similar feelings of Legend of Korra, rewriting Legend of Korra or something like this. That personally really annoys me, because writing something is really hard, as anybody who is a writer knows. And it's easier to look at the whole body of work from the side, consumed it all, not being the one who has written it all, and just say, oh, I feel like this needs to be tweaked. Like, it's just, I mean, first of all, once you start actually tweaking this, you realize how much, like, it opens a whole can of worms. It's not that easy to tweak things like that in the story, and everybody who have ever edited their story knows that as well. And it's just makes almost make you feel like when you're an artist, when you put things out there, somebody will come in and say, oh, what I've done is so bad, let me quickly show you how to do it right. Somebody who never written the stories. Well, you know, some people do write the stories who make these videos, but you know, it seems like that from the outside point of view, but obviously whoever has written before, we know that, you know, writing is hard, and people who come up with these small simple solutions, it's not that simple. Like, once you start actually applying the solution, something is going to break. Stories are complicated to do, and it's almost like this, how do I say, like, diminutive attitude towards our writers, as if we're not working super hard and writing those stories and thinking through so many important details and trying to connect worlds, characters, like personalities together, including plots and events and everything, and just, you know, implying that they, without thinking too much about our story, could just quickly fix it, as if we're so incompetent. Like, that's my personal pet peeve. But in general, the feeling that, you know, any story can be criticized to death. There's no story that is immune. The biggest, the most known, the most liked stories, and, you know, even like when people actually talking positive about certain stories, they started with, well, this movie is not perfect, well, this book is not perfect, but I like it. Like, it's almost like this premise, like, of course it's not perfect. Like, it's almost like it's anyway, we're going to talk into more details. I have a structure for this video, and I'm going to stick to the structure. But anyway, this always it is fascinating to me, including that I myself just made this video last week, and I want to, you know, talking about Avatar and the things that I thought was not great, like needed improvement, or just something that I found bizarre, a little strange. And today I wanted to talk about this topic. Why are we so passionate about looking into negatives about the stories? Why there are so many negative reviews about the stories? Why people just don't, like, not finish the story instead and just go away and not talk about it? Why they finish watching, you know, experience the story and talk negatively? And how we as artists deal with that, how we continue creating, knowing that this is unfortunately the reality of this world. So let's talk about it. First thing that I want to talk about is the nature of the story itself. You know, the way what the story basically is us experience something through our involvement in the story. And this is just the way that we experience it. The story itself is not exactly like music. It's not exactly like piece of art or a piece of, like, some sort of image that we see somewhere that we look at it and we're like, oh, deem it like what we feel about it, good or bad, or just enjoy or not enjoy, not just looking at it. It doesn't work like that with the story. Story you have to really experience. Story does require from you to invest, to live through it. And we kind of have to immerse ourselves in the story a little bit more than in some other piece of art. So, and because this is the nature of the stories, we do consume stories for different reasons. Some stories we enjoy because we want something like wish fulfillment. We want to read something like romance and something like happy romantic sweet stories, or stories that have happy ending. Because maybe, for example, in our life we are going through the harder patch, or in our life like something makes us unhappy and we want to just read the story where everything works out, where characters are rewarded for their good deeds, where the love interest that the character meets at the beginning of the story is the love interest that the character will end up in the end of the story, get married, have a lot of kids, be happy, whatever, and where the good guys win, and when the world is kind of just. Sometimes we want to read something like that, or we want to read a fantasy. Not necessarily read, like watch. We want to experience fantasy of the life that we don't have right now. It kind of connected to what I said previously, but like imagine the story about people who are very rich, the story of the people who are very beautiful, the story of the people who are very successful, the story of people who get to live in fantastical, magical worlds, something that we do not experience in our personal life, and we just read it to feel like we're experiencing the life that we can only dream of. That could be one way people want to experience the story. People can also want to experience the story of something more dark, more complicated, more nuanced, something that they just want to experience, but they want to understand the experience of, but they don't want to live through. I think that's why people drawn to some stories, like even some drama stories on YouTube, like people are talking about their negative experience with that, negative experience with that. Like people like the entertainment and like the journey that the storyteller went through, but they don't necessarily want to experience it themselves. That's why the story is a fantastic vessel to just live through some sort of experience without endangering yourself and being in the comfort of your own home, or anywhere, like yourself being safe. I personally went through the phase where I actually don't know what's wrong with me, but I liked listening to the story of women going through some, how do you call it, some sort of difficult pregnancy stories. For some unknown reason, I'm not pregnant, I don't have kids, I'm not in the point of life when I'm thinking about it, but for some reason I was so fascinated, just listen to the women how they're going through these horrific stories, and it just was fascinating to me. And obviously I didn't want to live through this story, and I feel sorry for ladies that went through it, but it was so fascinating for me to listen and just observe, I guess, the emotions they were going through. That was the most fascinating, like observe how they were talking about all different emotions they were going through, and all of them are pretty negative emotions, how they were dealing with that. That was so fascinating to me. I don't know why. That was some random reason why I was listening to it. Some people like to watch thrillers when I see something that's, scary, dangerous, maybe unsavory, but they're safe all the time. Some people like to watch, some action movies, and action in the movie industry basically stand for violence. Like some people want to see some violence, like we're watching, for example, John Wick, right? We're watching John Wick, we're seeing John Wick kicking butts, and actually like inflicting a lot of pain to people. Like when people are fighting, we don't want to be in this type of fight, like please, none of us want to be in this sort of situation, but it's very entertaining to look at. So sometimes we want to experience the stories like this, or sometimes we watch the stories out of just pure curiosity about certain experience. We just curious how people with certain life experience live and how their life is, and it's just interesting. Like for me, this type of stories, if I'm talking about consuming media that is negative, this is something that is absolutely fascinating to me. I just like to see people with different situations or experiencing different traumatic events, how they're going through it. Like that's something that I feel bad to say enjoy, but there's something that is interesting to me, because I guess kind of like the same thing with like women and pregnancy stories from before. I just fascinating to see how people's mind work in the situation that is like crisis like, or so close to their heart, that how they're getting them out of the situation, how they're processing certain negative situations. I just love this human resilience and see how it is. But so we consume stories for absolutely different reasons, clearly. And sometimes we watch for something more simple, like just we want to evoke certain emotions. For example, now we came from work, we're very tired, and we watch something lighthearted that will make us feel like nothing is that serious and we want to watch a comedy, or we just want to have an eye candy and just gonna feel fun, we're gonna watch some anime, for example, on Netflix or something like that. So there's a lot of ways that, there are a lot of reasons why we experience the story, and all the stories that we choose to experience we typically experience through characters. And we get so invested exactly because of this, because the story takes us through certain emotion journey, through certain experience of our own. It gets us into the story, it gets us very connected to the characters. The best stories will get you really invested what characters are doing and connected to people that are in the story. And because of that, you're so close, you almost start kind of mentally placing yourself in this story. So it's almost like you're living in this avatar of this character, and that is really close. So because at this point we're putting ourselves in the story a little bit, and when story takes a different turn, it's not even disappointing, it can be a little bit disturbing. Imagine you watching again the story about like something like wish fulfillment. You watch the story about this girl that goes to this fantasy world, she meets this prince or whatever, and you're like, oh yeah, I really want to watch the story, I really want to experience all this adventure. And then she learns that the prince cheated on her, murdered her mother, and trying to murder her, like doing a lot of crazy things, and and it gets like really downhill, and you feel almost disturbed because you already kind of place yourself in the story in certain capacity, and you place yourself to like certain fullness because you're expecting the safe ride, right? Or you're watching a thriller and you're like, ooh, yes, and I'm invested because I want to know how it's gonna work out and it's gonna be super smart. And then in the end you realize that, oh, this thriller was not really super smart at all, and you were just so invested, so in the story, just experience this cleverness of writing and whatnot, and just was not it, and you feel duped. And because you're so close to the story and the subject, that just feels very strongly. And usually what, at least from my observation, people who are experience a strong disappointment and have this negative reaction to the story are usually the ones who were absolutely in love with the premise of the story itself, or loved the idea of what they think the story going to be about, and they already liked something that they imagined they're going to experience, so they were just hoping so much to experience something, and it just wasn't delivered, and the disappointment is very strong. So I feel that when people experience that, and when they go and write negative reviews, it's not only because just they have this disappointment that is so strong, and it actually kind of overrides the appreciation that they also had for some aspects of the story, and that's why it's like bursting out. But it's also like the way to process that. It's almost like a psychological experience. We want to talk it through, we want to explain why we didn't like it, we want to just make people to understand that we didn't like it. I almost feel like it's really like a therapeutic thing, because imagine you mentioned yourself in the story, you were very close to the story, you invested in some capacity, and then the story turned out to be something different, and you have this very strong feeling because you were so close, and now you have to process this feeling. Now you are left with this feeling of being confused, being potentially a little bit disturbed. And I think disturbed is a little bit of a strong word, but I do think that on some level you kind of are. I use this strong word just because, again, you're so close to the subject, and I feel like talking about it and expressing it just helps you to process that. And at the same time, it also, you almost want validation. When people go through some experience in life, it's just I guess a psychological thing, and I'm fascinated with psychology. This is a whole nother thing. I read and learn about psychology and psychological techniques every day, and I used to learn it since I was a very young kid because I was so fascinated with people's minds. And I just happen to have just a bunch of friends who are either clinical psychiatrists, like doing the clinical psychology, or like therapists. So I always talk about this thing, so that's why I'm referring to that, and that's why I like to looking at this from that point, is that when we experience some strong emotion that is like new, or like disturbs us in a certain way, just very strong, first of all, we want to find validation. We want to somebody tell us, yeah, what you feel is like totally valid. Like I would feel the same in the same situation. Your feelings are correct, rational, and appropriate to experience that you went through. Like we want to feel that first. And I feel like when people are something puts them off from the story, they start talking because it's so important for them to find somebody who says, yeah, you're right. Yeah, totally. I agree 100%. And it's kind of, I feel, the nature of people to go ahead and try to process negative emotions, because when we have negative emotions, we just need to process them. We need to do something about it, and we have this urge to, take some action to make them go away because they don't feel good. But with positive emotions, we just feel them and they're like, oh yeah, that was nice, and we don't really dwell on them. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's kind of natural considering how humans are, but also it's kind of very disappointing. So the story that was like 50% fantastic and you really loved it, and then 50% like took a turn that wasn't expected for you. Now the story, in your mind, you're only going to be hooked on how you didn't like it and how you felt all these emotions that are not positive about it. So that's something that is interesting. So I feel like this is one of the reasons why people fall into this trap to just talking about stories in a negative way and have just stuck in this loop of talking about the problems. It's because they're trying to rationalize why they feel this feeling of disturbance and this feeling of wrongness when they were experiencing the story. And I feel if you break it down as like you're being too close to the story, you almost put yourself in the story, and the story took a turn, and it almost felt like it took you with it, like to the direction that you didn't want to go, and it feels very close, and you're just trying to process that feeling. I think looking at it this way, to me at least, it makes sense. It's a shame that this happens, but it seems to be the reason at least why. But on another side, just if this is just the thing that mentally what's happening when we perceive the story. But there is another aspect to all the stories, is that story is a product that, and this is adding a whole new level of context to why people get negative. If you think about it, very few stories are free to make and free to consume. If you talk about movies, they're not free. You have to, rent them, buy them, go to the cinema, stream it. You have to pay money to experience the story. Also, the story is not free to make. Filmmakers, if we're talking about movies, have to spend a lot of money to create these stories. The same if you're watching something like cartoons, reading books, you have to buy them. And people who are doing them, like publishers who are getting you money, they pay obviously writers who wrote the story or pitched the story. It's a product. It takes money to create, it takes money to consume. And, some stories, of course, are free. For example, my story, the link in the description below, but but still it's kind of is, but it's kind of isn't, because you have to, it requires you some sort of action. You have to spend time consuming that. You have to in case of my story, there is option, I guess, to get access to better experience with the story. You can go to Patreon and get PDFs of all the chapters, and you can read them in my sitting properly, not like a page per week. That's not ideal, but even so, it's still some effort needed. But most stories, actually what I do notice, the people do criticize, I feel, stories less that are free, because I guess I think it's important to mention that the story can be a product, because definitely I don't experience too much negativity for my story. Sometimes here and there random things will be there, but mostly people are very, very sweet, and I really appreciate. So if you look at the story as a product, that's kind of actually makes sense to be not satisfied with the product if you paid for something. Like when you get the story, again, remember we talked earlier about, you get certain things from different stories, certain things you expect to get, and you read or consume different stories for different reasons. This is what you're paying for. You're paying for getting this experience. So when the experience doesn't deliver, you feel duped, you feel like you wasted your money, and you feel like you didn't get the product that you really wanted to. So from that perspective, that kind of makes sense. So that's why if you think about like all the advices that are talking about story structures, or like how to create like, like 3-act structure, like 5-act structure, or 27 step, or whatever, like save the cat thing. I don't know, like I personally don't like the story structures, but I do understand why they're so important. They're very good for when you're creating and like thinking about your story as a product that people can buy, because these structures ensure that the consumer of the story gets the experience that they want. So they kind of are able to kind of get what they want for money that they're giving you, or like they're just getting the payoff that they wanted to. And the same reason is why genres exist. It's marketing categories, really, because if you go to the bookshop and you really want to experience this wish fulfillment love story, you go to romance, because romance is a genre that is really based on you reading, and there will be a character, there will be a love interest, and they're going to be together by the end. That's the premise of romance. And if you grab in a romance, you know what you're getting. But if you go to the fantasy book and you grab it and you there's like in the description you see like this lady meet this guy or whatever, it's a fantasy, so the good outcome of romance is not guaranteed. In fact, somebody's probably gonna die because it's fantasy, or there probably might be like several love interests. If I'm thinking about like exception of the rule is Sarah J. Maas, but because her books are really not I think classified correctly, they put it as a fantasy, but it's actually just a romance in a fantasy setting. So that's kind of like a funny thing. That's why fantasy readers go read Sarah J. Maas and they go like, what the hell is that? Like, yo, that's real weird. Why is that a thing? But then if romance readers read that, they're like, oh, that's so amazing. It's the best book ever because it also has fantasy. What a nice bonus. But so from this perspective, like all of these things are actually set up to help you connect to the story that matches your expectation the most and get you experience the story the way that you want, and to be happy with this. And so from this perspective, upsetness is understandable. So when people do criticize the movies, it kind of makes sense. They paid to watch them, and the movie was made to get their money. That's the nature of that. So also, when it's kind of also makes sense to question the movies or like the stories that are being paid for from the perspective of, well, you were making a product and we're the customer, and you needed to make the product the right product for us. So when people make the movies, yes, there's a lot of creative aspects to the movie, but in the end of the day, you're creating a product and it has to be created the certain way. So aside from the aspect of you just not liking the movie and thinking, oh, I paid for something that I didn't get, there is also a critique of, well, you did your product wrong because you knew what you were doing in the end. You knew that you were doing the product, you knew that I'm the consumer of the product, and you didn't think about the consumer when you were doing the movies. You could carry it away. So I guess from this perspective, this is how where my confusion with, my previous video for the Avatar went through, because I wonder, well, you have a lot of money and a lot of time to really make the story work. I'm just not understanding why certain parts of the actual storytelling just were not it, because it's a product that you were paid to do and you are getting money from people to watch. I'm just assuming that some professional would come in, like some more writers who would just streamline these points. So this is my, I guess, question. So it's tricky. So story is still something that is more than a product, but a lot of the time it is. And from this perspective, like just talking about these aspects of the story and what it is, let's talk about us creators and how we create the story and what story creation even is. So first, why do we create the stories? We create the stories mostly, in my opinion, for the same reasons that a lot of people consume it. We want to experience something. We want to go through something. We want to experience certain worlds, certain characters, certain situations, certain things. It is for us also a form of escapism sometimes from life. And it's also the form of just having certain emotions and living through certain emotions and certain experience safely. And also in my case, I'm sure to a lot of storytellers out there, it's also the case. It just gives life purpose a little bit to have these projects. or project in my case, where you're working on something in the end, and then you have this major sense of fulfillment when you completed it. It is also satisfying to improve your skills all the time. But most of the time, I do find that this is just experience just the same as the readers, except we do have all the control. And we really, if readers, they're constantly looking for something that can satisfy what they want to experience. For us, we don't have to look, really. We can just make it up and just come up with exactly the thing that we want. And that is on its own really an individual experience. And what we want to experience and what we want to create and the world that we want to come up with, it's so personal. And sometimes it's more complicated than just having a romance, or sometimes it's just more complicated to have an adventure in a fantasy world. Sometimes it's more complicated than having a thriller. Sometimes you want to combine things up and just come up with something weird. And, from here, it's becomes, I think, hopefully that's starting to make sense, why we actually can never really control what people's reaction is going to be. Like, it's almost set up this way that somebody will definitely hate what we've done and somebody would definitely disagree with what we did in our story. And I actually can argue with when we write our stories. So this is like a personal take, honestly. So maybe I'm gonna upset some people, but I kind of mentioned about the story structures. And I have a video that I made. I think it was my second or third video that I ever did for this channel. That is just a very, one of the first YouTube videos. And this is where I rant about story structures, because I think that was the time when I'm not sure if it just was my experience that everybody was talking in 2019, 2020 about the story structures for writers. But maybe, I don't know, maybe just my experience that I was recommended these videos on YouTube a lot, but this was the moment when I was seen everywhere. It's like, if you're a writer, you need to do 3-act structure, you have to do 5-act structure, or Saves the Cat structures for the, like, Saves the Cat writes the novel or whatever. It's like everybody was talking about it. And I was so annoyed with this, because, and this is my personal opinion, because at this point, I felt that it is very limiting, and I felt that it's just catering to just one purpose. It just creates the story that is commercial. At some point, somebody realized, for example, in the movie industry, that 3-act structure, not probably in the movie industry, it's probably coming from theater. I didn't research it too much, I'm sorry, but like, somebody realized that this is a fantastic way to get people's attention and make sure they're very clear what's happening in the story. They're always following along, but at the same time, like, it works for something, but it doesn't mean that's the only thing that works, and it doesn't mean it's the only thing that should work. Story can be told in so many different ways, and it cannot, like, it's not possible. There's like 3 to 5 ways to structure your story to make sense of it. Like, structure of the story is just a presentation, just creating a certain experience of how people, going through the story. But it doesn't have to be the only answer. Yes, it's good for commercial, but also the story structure becomes so predictable, and it's almost like drive a big part of the plot and big part of the narrative and the big way of how the story is going to play out and what the story could be and experiences the story can create. I felt every time I would, listen to videos like that, on advices like that, I would just felt so bored. And, it's also, in my experience, mostly Western style of storytelling. And all Western style of storytelling is not be all style of storytelling. You can tell the story in many ways. If you look in certain Japanese stories or Korean stories, or even like Asian stories, they have different structure whatsoever. Indian stories have different structure whatsoever. Where I am from, like Russian stories, some of them like really, really interesting on its own. And it doesn't, like, the story doesn't have to be limited by story structure. You can do really whatever you want. And just be like, I'm, as an artist, personally just want to experience, I want to experience this, of my characters. I want to just experience my world in the way that I want. I want to be just driven by my characters, by my world, by creation that I have. I want my story to make sense. Still, obviously, you know, when it's a story, it has to have some point. And as long as you follow the point of your story and ideally like the themes of your story, like when the story just makes sense, it's like makes sense why you just experience the story, it still works. You can use whatever story structure. But, you know, if you're a creator, you can use a story structure to hopefully, and like the more specific genre norms, like every genre has certain things that are specific to this genre, and just follow that so that readers who read your story are typically satisfied. That's why like romance is so nice, like, and detective stories are like so satisfying, and that's why it's people who read stories like this are usually binge readers, because they know what to expect and they get it every time, because these stories are very formulaic. And they have this very robust, like for example in romance, like it's really spoilers. the story structure has spoilers. They gotta be together. That's something that you expect. So so as a creator, we can choose, what do we want? Do we want to make sure our story is accessible to a lot of people, to a certain audience? Then we can use story structures, genre convention, and all of these good things. And we just overall reader expectations. Typically people do want a happy ending. Typically people do want two couple to end up together. Typically people do want the good guys to win. Typically people want the story of the world to be just, or at least that the story plays by its own rules. If you establish at the beginning of the story that the world is very cynical and the story ends up being like super just, it doesn't make sense. So the story needs to kind of like deliver on the promise, like from the first pages. That's kind of like when we talked earlier, like dissonance happening, like the story becomes something else. It's kind of has to have the same logic. There is a way that you can try to minimize the fact that some people are going to be disappointed, but also at the same time, you can make a choice to just be true to yourself and just be true to your vision, and just maybe try to be very confident in your vision overall and know what it is through the story to make the story more or less consistent. And there's obviously something to be said about you actually making mistakes by jumping around and making the story really strange. And there's today you want this, and in the same chapter, the next chapter of the story, you just change your opinion and you change your mind, and now you want this outcome, and now you want the world to work differently. There is certain consistency that has to be present. I just go without saying that because having said that, that your story has to have certain level of like logic within it. It cannot be just all crazy. But in the end of the day, I hope all of these rambles help you to see that we cannot really avoid people being disappointed. And I think the important part is to just not take this disappointment as a real reflection of your work or your work being a failure, because it isn't. It's just, it didn't work out for some people. And, I'm not talking about I just don't want to confuse people, but I'm not talking about this when your story is objectively, can have some work, like you're not very, for example, you're not very good writer, and I think you guys understand the difference that I'm talking about here. But there always will be people who will be disappointed by a story. There always will be people who expect certain things from a story. There is always people who come to a story expecting something. Like, for example, I think I'm doing something sometimes when I ask some people who saw my story, who just mainstream readers, they tell me certain things that they think my story is going to be, and my story is not that. My story quickly stopped becoming that in the beginning. And for example, my mom didn't like certain things about my story when she read it as a novel, like the first arc of my comic, that the whole first arc is not real. My mom didn't like it. She disliked certain aspects of it because she was expecting certain things and she didn't get it, even though I believe I was good at communicating very early that, so the story is a little different. Certain things are already not going the same way. But, in the comic, I'm trying to be more obvious. I'm not conventionally doing something as, genres or suggests, but at the same time, I'm just trying to be more obvious, warning people ahead, like, hey, something might happen here that you don't expect. The story might not be exactly what you expect. So it's just a combination of not really worrying about people being disappointing, taking this as just the nature of people and how people experience story and how they react to them and how to react to certain things that can happen in the story. Knowing that, just not worrying about negativity too much. It's potentially going to happen, and it's just part of the job. And at the same time, just trying to be like honest with yourself and true to your vision, and just write the story that you want to write for the right reasons, like because you just want to write this good story and want to make it the best you can possibly make it. And yeah, so that's my conclusion for today. Hope that kind of helps you to take the edge off the scary business of writing your stories and putting your soul out there, and not thinking too much about negative comments, and just not freaking out too much when you see negative comments being thrown at stories that you don't even think are bad. And obviously there's something to be said about just let's be nicer when criticizing the work, which is normal. Let's just be nice and be respectful. Just pointing out things that you find are not really working. Just be nice in everything you do. So that's my ramble for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a good day. I hope you're going to continue to have a good day, and I see you in my next one. Thank you so much, guys.